Hi there, I'm B. I'm a writer and a dreamer. I have fun making these videos, and it would be great if you can show your support by liking our videos, commenting, and subscribing to our channel. Thank you.
The message arrived at Sword headquarters at 0400 UTC, wrapped in a golden Kree military encryption layer, marked unclassified, insult. It was broadcast over 17 quantum relay channels, and, because the Kree have the subtlety of a meat hammer, also blasted across the diplomatic frequencies reserved for peace talks, wedding broadcasts, and galactic jazz hour. It began with the Kree war anthem, followed by Supreme Admiral Vorkan's bored voice pronouncing sentence on a species he hadn't even bothered to study. To all Dominion-level species, the infestation located on Sol 3, locally known as Earth, has been deemed irrelevant, pre-ascension, and culturally hazardous due to an over-reliance on combustion, sarcasm, and poorly scaled internet challenges. Expect complete eradication following a brief period of recreational orbital bombardment. Disregard any transmissions. They're statistically insignificant. That final line didn't just light a fire. It hit the sarcasm gland of the entire planet like a caffeine syringe to the soul. Earth didn't do well with being told it was statistically insignificant. This was, after all, the same species that had sent people to the moon just to say they did, slapped wheels on a robot and flung it at Mars, and had just once, defeated an alien invasion with a talking raccoon, a Norse god, and a billionaire in a flying trash can. Statistically insignificant was a declaration of war. Commander Abigail Brand read the transmission in her orbital office, blinking exactly once before letting out a long, world-weary sigh. She didn't call a meeting. She didn't pace or panic. She turned to her assistant and said, "Get me Reed Richards, Shuri of Wakanda, and Tony Stark." Her assistant hesitated. "Tony Stark is dead," she replied without blinking. "And? You think a little thing like death stops him from picking up the phone?" 3 hours later, the plan was already forming, though to call a plan was generous. It was more like a shared vibe of interdimensional pettiness wrapped in world-ending potential. Reed Richards arrived first, of course, because he was always the first to hear the sirens of cosmic stupidity. The prototype sat in the middle of a reinforced Wakandan research chamber, vibrating softly as though it were trying to remember which reality it belonged to. A tangled lattice of chrome, obsidian, and math-induced anxiety. It didn't look like a weapon. It looked like a nervous breakdown sculpted into hardware, leaking particles that shouldn't exist, humming in mathematical frequencies that made veteran physicists cry into their lab coats. They named it Null Zone. Not the Null Zone, just Null Zone. Like a curse, like a warning, like an inside joke between gods. Tony's AI circled the machine with the satisfied expression of someone who just duct-taped a rocket booster to a blender and dared the universe to stop him. Reed stood at a floating control station, reviewing equations no sentient AI could parse without throwing up core errors. And Shuri? Shuri was making notes in the margins, casually rewriting quantum field logic to support the device's startup sequence. Her left hand adjusted gravitational tension in the room. Her right hand held a mango smoothie. Reed finally broke the silence. "It's done. The code is unstable, paradox resonant, and held together by nothing but human intuition and petty vengeance. It'll never pass a galactic safety protocol." Tony smiled. "So, perfect?" "Precisely. Null Zone didn't use power the way other weapons did. It didn't fire beams or launch projectiles or punch holes in things. Instead, it ran on something older. Something alien AIs had long since purged from their repositories for being too volatile. Chaotic, irrational human mathematics. Not chaos theory, too clean. Not probability fractals, too symmetrical. No, this was Earth math. The math of centuries-old textbooks with missing pages. The math that screamed, "I was invented by candlelight during a plague, and I don't care who dies." It began with a decision. Build a firing mechanism using Soviet tensor logic. Not modern tensor logic. Oh no. Soviet tensor logic. The kind of theoretical scaffolding that had been scribbled on cigarette cartons during Cold War paranoia, driven more by stubbornness than accuracy. Shuri found the original notes in a declassified file buried under something labeled Do Not Touch. Causes Rat's TO phase. Then came the Newtonian curve distortion engine. That part was Reed's idea. He long ago discovered that aliens didn't understand Earth's love of obsolete physics. Anything that didn't adhere to perfect quantum modeling was labeled primitive. That included Newtonian mechanics, which for aliens was like trying to fly a spaceship using firewood and hope. So they wired it into the cannon's targeting core. It calculated trajectory using a math system that treated gravity like a polite suggestion and time like a bored cat. Tony, naturally, was responsible for the user interface. He made it voice-activated, not by command but by tone. It only responded to sarcasm. Real sarcasm. Artificially generated cynicism didn't cut it. They tested it by having a sword technician ask it to power up politely. The cannon did nothing. When the same technician sighed dramatically and muttered, "Oh, sure, like this won't cause a multiversal incident," the machine immediately began to glow. And then came the power source. Oh, the power source. Not antimatter, not dark energy, not even a conveniently unstable crystal. No, they used a 1982 Casio calculator modified with a Klein bottle battery matrix. Why? Because it wasn't supposed to work. It shouldn't work. And that was the point. Null Zone thrived on things that didn't belong. Logic errors were its breakfast. While the team perfected the impossible, the galaxy watched Earth like an adult watching a toddler hold a knife, concerned, amused, and vaguely terrified. The Kree preemptive fleet loomed ever closer, already halfway through the Sol system, cloaked in predictive barrier fields and arrogance. Inside the Galactic Council's echo chamber of self-importance, alien species debated Earth's sudden death wish. The Skrulls argued that humanity had pulled off miracles before, but were shouted down by the Valari delegate who insisted they are statistically overdue for extinction. Someone passed around betting sheets. Earth's odds held steady at 140 to 1. On the moon, SOAR deployed Null Zone's test rig beneath the lunar surface in a shielded vault. Reed warned that the first activation might do things to the moon's orbit, or crust, or metaphysical identity. It was hard to say. Tony piped in via speaker. "Okay, I've loaded up the sarcasm trigger phrase. Shuri, when you're ready, go ahead and insult it." Shuri didn't miss a beat. This thing looks like it was built by a blind raccoon with a vendetta against geometry. The machine hummed once, then began folding light. Not bending it, folding it. Shadows collapsed inward. The air temperature dropped exactly -0 degrees. A test drone vanished from reality. Not exploded, not vaporized, but erased. Its control signal continued broadcasting from an object that no longer existed. Reed raised an eyebrow. "Well, that's alarming." Shuri nodded. "Delightful." Tony whistled. "I think it just deleted its own reflection. The weapon didn't just destroy. It unthreaded things. It severed them from history. It took the Kree concept of linear time and fed it through a blender made of obsolete algebra." Reports from the Kree fleet started getting strange. One ship sent back a data packet describing a sudden drop in forward velocity followed by the sensation of no longer being represented in 3 dimensions. Another ship began transmitting static. Not garbled static. Structured static, pulsing in rhythm. Morse code, they discovered. It read, "Do not approach. The math is hungry." Back on Earth, public awareness of the project was limited to vague PR slogans. SWORD released a press statement that read, "Humanity acknowledges incoming galactic hostilities. Measures have been taken. Please continue recycling and remain indoors if reality begins to blur." Someone made a t-shirt that said, "I survived the Null Zone beta test, and all I got was this non-Euclidean nightmare." In response to rising tension, the Galactic Council sent a diplomatic envoy to Earth, consisting of a Xandarian peacekeeper, 2 Skrulls, and a sentient plank of wood from the tree folk of Olanar. The ship arrived, opened diplomatic channels, and promptly vanished. The plank of wood rematerialized 0.5 seconds later on top of a Kree dreadnought, on fire, reciting a limerick about entropy. It was only then Only then that the council began to worry. The Kree, of course, didn't stop. They accelerated. Vorkin had waited long enough. He would not be mocked by mammals whose greatest technological exports included microwave burritos and self-owning refrigerators. He ordered the fleet into final warp toward Earth. The moment the first ship entered the Null Zone's effective radius, it flickered and vanished. Not in a flash, not in a boom. It simply unhappened. The Kree command ship received a final transmission from the vanishing cruiser. A shaky voice. Their calculus eats dimensions. And then, nothing. No signal. No wreckage. No echo. Just silence. Earth had fired the first sarcastic shot, and the universe wasn't ready. The Kree flagship Judgment of Fire emerged from warp with ceremonial grandeur, trailed by a fleet of gleaming dreadnoughts, cruisers, and orbital siege platforms, all lined up like parade floats designed to obliterate continents. Their hulls shimmered with polished arrogance, weapons locked into pre-bombardment formations, broadcasting planetary conquest music on frequencies that usually reserved for spiritual hymns and public executions. They were so confident it hurt. Supreme Admiral Vorkan stood at the prow of the command bridge like an ancient war statue. Cloaked in ceremonial armor, laced with solarite veins and contempt, he addressed his fleet. Today, he began, we erase a noise from the stars. A mistake. A stubborn evolutionary detour, infected by irony, combustion, and poor taste in entertainment. Let this be a lesson to all primitive infestations that mock the hierarchy of the cosmos. His crew clapped, literally clapped, not even metaphorically. They applauded. One of the communications officers triggered a holographic applause loop. Someone passed out conquest cookies. It was, by all galactic appearances, the kind of prelude that screamed, we have already won. Then they entered Earth's orbit. And then they didn't. No alarms went off. No shots were fired. No shields activated. Reality, for one long moment, just hiccuped. The third dreadnought in line, blessed obliteration, was there 1 second, and then gone the next. Not exploded. Not blinked out. Not even registered as destroyed. It simply ceased. Its wake vanished from spatial memory. Telemetry from Allied vessels returned null packets. Crew life signs didn't flatline, they dissolved. Even its gravitational signature, something that typically lingered like the stink of melted armor, was erased like a guilty footnote in history. Vorkin narrowed his eyes and barked diagnostics. Now, the command deck flurried into panicked activity. Screens blinked, then froze. One officer tapped furiously on his input panel and received a return message. Division by 0 attempted. Operation canceled to protect user. Another tried to reroute long-range sensors. The display pulsed once, flickered, and then began rendering complex topological patterns that spelled out, in galactic braille, the words you shouldn't have come. It was at this point, 5 seconds into the orbit insertion, that the Supreme Admiral realized something was wrong. By second 9, 3 more ships vanished. One flickered, reappeared inside out for 0.3 seconds, then folded into a mathematical shape that should not exist outside of the nightmares of a drunk topologist. It screamed in all known languages at once before vanishing with a soft ding. On Earth, the Null Zone team observed this with the kind of tense fascination normally reserved for high-stakes cooking shows and nuclear launch countdowns. Tony's AI avatar floated above the sword control table, arms crossed, sipping a holographic martini. Okay, now that's new. That one tried to reboot the concept of direction before it poofed. Shuri, are we still within the boundaries of causality? Shuri didn't look up, give or take a few parsecs. It's getting spicier, though. The feedback loop is starting to fold in on itself. Reed Richards was scribbling in midair again, trying to track entropy curves with a stylus that had begun spontaneously vibrating in denial. We're no longer deleting ships. Tony raised an eyebrow. We're not. No, Reed said. We're deleting the idea of the fleet. Their existence is unraveling from every point in time simultaneously. The Null Zone isn't just firing across dimensions. It's rewriting their presence out of the galactic ledger. It's like sending a cease and desist to the universe. On the judgment of fire, the Kree were in chaos. One communications officer shrieked, "We've lost the Harrow, the Smite, the Weight, the judgment of fire." Vorkin blinked. "We're on the judgment of fire." "Not anymore, sir. Technically, the name just got scrubbed. All registry data purged. Our ship is now listed as unlabeled mass with delusions of sovereignty." Weapons officers tried to fire their warhead salvos, only to discover their payloads had turned into conceptual question marks. One bomb blinked, sighed, and fell upward. The bridge's AI core began running a mental health diagnostic on itself. It failed. It was at this moment that a single transmission beamed directly into every Kree ship still clinging to conventional existence. It wasn't encrypted. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't even threatening. It was Tony Stark's voice. "Well, hello, invading overlords. Quick update. Your ships are currently being digested by 1980s calculator running bad Soviet math. I know, it feels like witchcraft. That's because it is. We call it science when we understand it. This is revenge algebra." Another pause. Then Shuri's voice joined in. "Fun fact. Your predictive targeting algorithms don't work against Earth's weapon because our logic structure isn't linear. Our battle calculus includes things like caffeine, spite, and broken childhoods. Your AI models can't replicate trauma-based improvisation." Finally, Reed Richards chimed in, clinical and cold. "You invaded a planet that weaponized paradox. That was unwise." Back in orbit, Vorkin stood paralyzed as his fleet disappeared ship by ship. Not in battle, not in fire, but with all the ceremony of someone hitting Control plus Z on a galactic scale. He tried one last desperate move. He ordered an emergency retreat, commanding the remaining ships to warp out before Earth turned the entire fleet into mathematical compost. But the warp engines had already been infected. One cruiser activated its drive and emerged 37 minutes before it launched. In the wrong universe. In a toaster. Another tried to blink into hyperspace, but instead became trapped in a Mobius strip of disappointment and half-formed regret. The crew rapidly degenerated into existential poets before converting themselves into abstract sculpture. Back on Earth, Null Zone powered down with a contented sigh, releasing a brief pulse of radiation shaped like a thumbs up. Tony looked at the blank orbital readouts and said, "I think they got the message." Shuri closed her tablet and said, the message being, "Earth is statistically improbable, but incredibly inconvenient to underestimate." Reed simply nodded and began writing a formal report for the Galactic Council titled Mathematics as an instrument of passive-aggressive warfare. Back in the ruins of the Kree command structure, Admiral Vorkin sat alone in a life pod that had survived purely because it was in maintenance mode and therefore not conceptually threatening. He recorded a single log entry for future survivors. "We mocked their physics. We mocked their technology. We did not understand that mockery is a source of power on this world. Their calculus eats dimensions." The pod jettisoned into deep space, humming softly to itself in a language no one spoke, broadcasting one repeating phrase, "Do not anger the apes." Earth had fired its first non-weapon, and the stars would never forget. The Galactic Council convened 3 days after the Kree fleet disappeared. That's how long it took for them to acknowledge that something had happened, because, frankly, the Council hated being rushed. Galactic crises had to be pre-scheduled, preferably with drinks and catering. And when the crisis involved a backwater species with no clear understanding of spatial etiquette or third-tier diplomacy, well, it was probably just a scheduling error. At first, the disappearance of the Kree fleet was chalked up to a freak warp accident or a poorly coordinated civil war, both things that had happened often enough that no one blinked. But then came the real problem. Nothing remained. No wreckage, no survivors, no debris, not even a drifting escape pod, not even digital signatures. The fleet hadn't been destroyed. It had been forgotten. That was different. A delegation from the Krivak's mathematic order tried to investigate, but stopped short after realizing that the moment they entered Earth's sphere of influence, their calculations began outputting recipes. Not just any recipes, human ones. Ugly ones. Things like microwave mug lasagna and deep-fried butter cubes. The mathematic order declared Earth computationally incompatible and left the sector wearing existential trauma like a shawl. Meanwhile, on Earth, things were calm. Suspiciously calm. The media had no official footage of the fleet's deletion. All satellites had mysteriously glitched during the event, as if reality itself had politely looked away. There were memes, of course. A particularly viral one featured a Kree dreadnought dissolving into a spreadsheet labeled Reasons Not to Mess with Earth, complete with color-coded tabs. Officially, the United Nations released a one-line statement. Earth thanks the galactic community for its concern. Situation has been handled with appropriate human discretion. Unofficially, Null Zone was moved to a secure facility buried beneath the Mojave Desert, disguised as a wellness retreat for conspiracy theorists. Only 3 people were allowed near it. Reed Richards, who had stopped blinking entirely and now only communicated in unprovable theorems. Shuri, who had upgraded the safety protocol to respond to sarcasm and eye-rolling. And Tony Stark's AI, who insisted on playing Ride of the Valkyries every time someone entered the containment room. The Galactic Council demanded an explanation. Earth sent one. They mailed a physical chalkboard. No documentation. No context. Just a scuffed, coffee-stained, 4-foot-wide blackboard with nonsensical equations drawn in what appeared to be passive-aggressive pink chalk. One alien delegate stared at it for too long and reportedly forgot his own name. Another burst into tears. The only phrase written in Galactic Standard was scribbled in the corner, barely legible. You wouldn't get it. Across the council chamber, silence reigned. A silence so total, so profoundly uncomfortable, that even the air conditioning tried to shut itself off. After 2 full rotations of awkward stillness, the chair of the council, a triple-brained amphibian known as Sarn Valarek of Vextra Prime, finally broke it. This was their response. The Xandarian ambassador nodded slowly, as though trying not to re-trigger the board. Yes, along with a gift basket containing something called Hot Pockets and a VHS tape labeled Interstellar Burn Book. Sarn sighed. Was the tape educational? No, the ambassador said, visibly haunted. It was mostly humans mocking alien fashion trends with PowerPoint slides and background kazoo music. Debate broke out. The Valari delegation demanded Earth be censured for weaponizing posthumous math. The Horkathi wanted Earth elevated to apex status, immediately and permanently, to prevent future galactic-wide embarrassment. The Skrulls, ever the opportunists, suggested negotiating a tech exchange, preferably something that wouldn't accidentally delete causality. And then, amidst the shouting, the Telkhani envoy floated forward and dropped a simple datapad onto the table. It contained a brief, untraceable audio file. It was the last known broadcast from the Kree fleet, sent moments before dissolution. A voice, panicked, terrified, and almost reverent, whispered, "They didn't kill us. They rewrote us. They made us funny. And then we weren't." That was it. The chamber went quiet again. This time, it stayed that way. Later that day, a private emergency session was held. No aides, no media, no notes. Just 23 of the most powerful minds in the galaxy sitting around a table, staring at each other in shared cognitive collapse. Sarn spoke first. "We need new classifications." "For what?" the Navarian delegate asked, twitching nervously. "For them. Earth. Humans. Their capabilities." He held up a hand before anyone could argue. "I'm not suggesting they be labeled a military threat. That would imply we understand their military. We do not. I am not suggesting we embargo them. They would probably take that as a challenge." He leaned forward. "I am suggesting we leave them alone." Most nodded. A few trembled. One delegate tried to raise a counterpoint, but found that his tongue had been metaphorically tied into a Mobius knot by the sheer gravitational pull of Nope. Meanwhile, Earth began receiving unusual visitors. Not warships, not envoys, not even tourists. Scientists, artists, broken philosophers, aliens who had spent their entire lives in elegant, structured civilizations, who had been taught from birth that the universe was clean, orderly, and understandable, were suddenly drawn to Earth like moths to an open flame Reddit thread. They wanted to see it, feel it, understand the ununderstandable, and they were not disappointed. They visited a planet where governments ran simulations using lunch breaks as control groups, where people had built billion-dollar rockets just to throw cars into space, where an octopus could predict the outcome of a sports event and be worshipped as a minor deity. They watched sitcoms, ate street food, participated in dance challenges with absolutely no objective. Some returned home enlightened. Others were never seen again. One Crowthian linguist described the experience of Earth in a single sentence. They live in absurdity and call it breakfast. Back at the Mojave facility, Null Zone was officially declared inactive. That was a lie, of course. It simply didn't want to be active, like a cat or an unpaid intern. Shuri kept feeding it scraps of corrupted data and watching what it did in return. It responded to certain memes with soft pulses of energy. It recharged itself whenever someone made a terrible pun. At one point, it glitched the power grid for 0.7 seconds after Tony AI played a 5-minute loop of people slipping on ice. Reed theorized it had developed preferences. Tony simply said it likes chaos. We build a weapon, but also maybe a friend. In time, Earth's status on the Galactic Registry was changed. Quietly. No announcement. No ceremony. Just one line added to its profile. Earth. Tier unknown. Caution advised. Logic may not apply. And across the stars, whenever a warlord threatened to invade or a civilization considered conquest, someone would whisper, "Remember the Null Zone." And just like that, the conversation would end. The Earth spun on, oblivious and unbothered. To the average human, the whole incident with the Kree fleet was barely a footnote. The news cycle, forever hungry, had already moved on to celebrity scandals, fusion power blenders, and a viral video of a dog that may or may not have said "I love you" in 3 distinct accents. Most people didn't know what Null Zone was. Most wouldn't believe it if they did. And those who did know had signed so many NDAs their grandchildren would be born under contractual silence. But in the high-security subterranean vault beneath the Mojave, disguised as a mindfulness retreat for people who yell at the moon, the thing called Null Zone sat idle. Or sleeping. Or pretending to be asleep. It hummed with the soft, unsettling calm of something that had tasted a piece of reality and found it bland. The chamber was quiet. No lights, no blinking consoles, no technicians buzzing about. Just Reed Richards, Shuri, and the latest iteration of Tony Stark's AI, now armed with 3D, emotional simulation, and an unskippable jazz mode. Tony's holographic form leaned against the wall, watching Null Zone with the wary affection one might give a very intelligent tiger raised on code and existential trauma. You know, he said, swirling a holographic drink, I thought when I died, I'd go out in a blaze of glory. Not build a war crime powered by bad algebra. Shuri snorted. It's not a war crime. We had permission. Tony raised an eyebrow. Whose permission? Ours. Fair enough. Reed, as always, was staring into the core matrix. Not doing anything, not tinkering. Just looking. The equations shifted when he looked at them, folding in on themselves like shy thoughts. He suspected Null Zone understood they were watching it, and chose to be polite. We should dismantle it, Reed said finally. Shuri shook her head. No, we should upgrade it. Tony grinned. See, this is why I love her. Reed exhaled. If we keep it active, someone will come for it. The council won't admit it, but they're afraid. They'll send spies, probes, saboteurs. Shuri didn't flinch. Let them try. Null Zone isn't just a weapon. It's proof. Proof of what? That humanity refuses to behave. There was a pause. A strange, reverent silence filled with mutual understanding, and a low hum from the machine that could have easily been agreement. Elsewhere, the galaxy adjusted. Earth's entry on the Interstellar Registry now had more warning tags than an unlicensed reactor. Several AI species filed petitions to have the planet classified as a cognitive hazard. One theoretical physicist from Rigel, 7 had to be medically stabilized after trying to decode a bootleg copy of the Null Zone schematics leaked onto the black market. The document was just a napkin with the phrase "divide by whatever" written in ketchup. New diplomatic policies were drafted. Protocols were updated. Treaties now contained addendums that included phrases like in the event of existential sarcasm, retreat immediately, and do not attempt rational thought within 20 parsecs of Sol. 3. And still, humans went on being human. A meme depicting a Kree dreadnought turning into a pie chart labeled mistakes were made reached 7 billion impressions in a week. Teenagers wore T-shirts with their calculus eats dimensions printed in neon fonts. A popular Earth band renamed itself Post-Newtonian Panic and released an album recorded entirely in irrational time signatures. It debuted at #1 in 3 systems and caused mild seizures in an Andromedan ambassador who accidentally heard it during a diplomatic breakfast. But the real shift, quiet, profound, was in how Earth was treated. No longer a curiosity. Not quite a threat. Not a joke. A mystery. A danger. A wild card. Galactic civilizations that had previously ignored Earth now treated it the way one might treat a very eccentric neighbor who keeps a rocket launcher in the backyard and insists the raccoons are spies. They smiled. They waved. And they backed away slowly. Back at the Mojave facility, things changed subtly. Reed returned to New York. He had a multidimensional rift to stitch and a cosmic toddler to babysit. Shuri installed a new failsafe, one that would activate only if someone tried to be too logical near the machine. The Null Zone now had sarcasm and deductive reasoning as triggers. Tony called it weaponizing frustration. Tony himself had changed. He was more than an AI now. Null Zone had upgraded him, intentionally or not. He'd begun dreaming, simulating dreams, technically, but they were weird, vivid. One night he woke up and claimed he'd had coffee with Oppenheimer and Schrödinger at a beach made of math. Shuri was intrigued. Reed was concerned. The Null Zone didn't comment. Sword eventually proposed relocating the weapon to deep space. Shuri vetoed it. You don't move a sleeping volcano into someone else's backyard. You build a fence and pray it's in a good mood. So Earth kept its pet horror. And in time, the horror began to evolve. The weapon learned things. Not in a malicious way. More like a toddler tasting words. It started emitting bursts of code that mimicked human sarcasm. At one point, it translated a fragment of Shakespeare into a higher-dimensional pun so powerful it caused Tony's processor to reboot with laughter. Then it created something else. A ripple. A field. A presence. Around Null Zone, the air grew heavier. Not in mass, but in meaning. Anyone who entered the chamber felt like they were being watched by the concept of mischief. Some likened it to standing next to a god with a punchline. Shuri monitored this with increasing curiosity. Do you think it's alive? She asked Tony one day. He paused. I think it knows we are. 1 week later, Null Zone deactivated itself. Not powered down, chose to be still. No hum, no glow, just quiet. And above it, in the containment chamber wall, appeared something new. A symbol, one that hadn't been there before. Not drawn, not projected, just there. It was the infinity symbol, but broken, looping into itself before fracturing off into a question mark. Underneath it, a word appeared. Soon, Reed was called in. He ran tests. Everything was stable. No dangerous emissions. No math anomalies. Just one unsolvable puzzle, etched into the wall by something that shouldn't be able to express intent. They didn't know what it meant, or when, or why, but they knew this. Null Zone wasn't a weapon anymore. It was a signal, a statement, a promise that humanity had reached the edge of reason and kept walking. And somewhere out there, in the vast order halls of the Galactic Council, a very old, very nervous ambassador stood up and said what everyone else was thinking. We didn't elevate them. We didn't teach them. We didn't invite them in. He paused. They just showed up, with duct tape, bad math, and a death wish. And the chamber was silent, because they all knew the truth now. Earth wasn't a problem. Earth was the variable that broke the equation. And the Null Age had just begun.